Padraig O'Malley. Welcome to Unplanned.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here. You are a professor at UMass Boston, but you're also known for many books you've written in peace and conflict studies around the globe, from the Middle East, which is in the news today, to Northern Ireland, to Iraq, to Serbia, to all over the place. Today we want to talk about divided cities, which is something I know you've thought a lot about, and I really appreciate you taking some time to talk to us. What is a divided city?
A divided city is where you have two factions, generally either two religious or ethnic factions who claim ownership of the city. It's a microcosm usually of the division in the larger society. So Belfast would be a divided city, Bosnia would be, Sarajevo would be a divided city, Tripoli would be a divided city, Jerusalem is a divided city. Any place where you have this play between two polarizing forces, you have a divided city.
We're going to start with the polarizing forces, but just to let you know about Unplanned, which is the show where we look at cities and how they work, we're going to want to get to the city part of the discussion. But what are the polarizing forces? The news is full of them, so in some ways we all know what they are. We have a sense at some level. But in your experience, in your work, what have you seen to be the polarizing?
Well, generally nationalist, ethnic, religious, which kind of sometimes express themselves in terms of the use of violence, where there is a civil war or an intrastate conflict, and where different populations are segregated within their cities, have separate educational systems, and live on segregated housing estates, and always see the person on the other side of the divide as the other, and have very fixed ideas about who the other is. Now, the best example of that in terms of the physicality is probably Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland, to the extent that you have a long peace wall that trudges its way, weaves its way across Belfast, dividing Catholic communities from Protestant communities. And these walls have been operating now since the late 1960s, and there are gates in the wall, so that during the day the gates are open and people can pass through, and in the evening the gates are closed and they're separated from each other. And interestingly, since the peace agreement in 1998, the number of peace walls has gone up around Northern Ireland, not down. So division, these systemic divisions between the communities have hardened, not softened, despite the fact that there is a peace agreement.
Well, let's spend a minute on the walls, because walls are fascinating in lots of ways, and for people who think about cities as urban places and physical places, walls are all around us. What are the walls intended to achieve? Why build a wall in, say?
Simply division. The other side, one side thinks they will be invaded by the other and massacred or harmed in some way. They find the other side threatening, find its belief systems threatening, believes that its belief system is to take them over and acquire their property and their land. And these beliefs often go back historically to the 18th century, That's where they first began to manifest themselves in Belfast, when it became an industrial city, and two populations, Catholic and Protestant, divide for the same jobs. So it entrenches economic differences, it entrenches wealth differences, and generally it badly entrenches sectarianism on both sides.
Let's spend another minute on the walls. Almost as a metaphorical matter, but maybe as a practical economic matter, why are the gates open during the day but locked at night?
Because people aren't afraid of each other during the day. They're small gates, enough for a person to pass through, up and down. The walls in Belfast have another feature, which of course is that they've become a tourist attraction. So former paramilitaries who now are in the tourist business kind of will arrange for tourists to give them a tour of the walls on their side of the divide. They're on both sides. So you can have one wall, and on one side you have beautiful murals. So they're actually quite striking murals of all type that people are in no hurry to take them down. They'd hurt them economically. And everybody who goes to Belfast has said, make sure you get a tour of the walls.
Now, why are there more walls now, post-1998?
Because, again, despite a peace agreement, the peace agreement really achieved what's called a dirty peace. That is peace without violence. But it didn't address the systemic underlying causes of that division. And that division is still between two communities, one of which wants to stay in the United Kingdom and one of which wants to become part of United Ireland. And there has been a hardening of sectarianism. And one thing about conflict in divided societies is that the conflict ends up being about the conflict. Now, by that I mean is certainly in Bosnia and Northern Ireland again, each side tries to memorialize the conflict in its terms. So there's a conflict of memorialization. Whose narrative becomes the narrative, the dominant narrative of what the conflict was about? And in fact, one of the fears of Protestants is that in a united Ireland, the Sinn Féin stroke IRA narrative of the conflict would become the dominant national narrative, and their narrative would be marginalized and put aside.
Who decided where the wall should be built? I mean, who drew that line and said, this is where the wall is going to be built?
Well, mostly it was drawn in between what they would call communities where Catholic and Protestant communities lived adjacent to each other. So you can go up a street and kind of the first 50 houses up are all Catholic, the second 50 are all Protestant, and they put a wall between number 50 and number 51, right down the middle between the two communities. And that was done by the civil authorities and the British and the British Army.
I keep thinking the only walled city I know, in this sense of a walled city, doesn't exist as a walled city anymore, but it's Berlin. And I'm curious in what way you would compare, say, the Northern Ireland example to, say, Berlin in the 1970s or 80s or whenever.
Well, the Berliners wanted the walls taken down. The Northern Irish wanted the walls put up.
Right.
So that's the simple. The Berliners welcomed the walls coming down, and in Northern Ireland, whenever authorities talk about knocking down a wall between the two communities, both communities together go to the local authority and say, don't put a wall up. And the new walls go up when both communities go to their local authority and say, we'd like you to put a division between us.
And so let's spend a minute talking about the work you've done over the past decades. If you see a city like that, and you've seen many cities like you've interacted with lots of cities like that, either with physical walls or just in that situation, where do you start? What do you try to do when you arrive and you say?
Well, that brings me back to what the concept of the Forum for Cities in Transition is.
Right.
And it's based on a concept that grew out of my addiction. The Alcoholics Anonymous is probably the best vehicle for the treatment of addiction. And it's based on a simple concept that one divided society is in the best, one alcoholic is in the best position to help another. And they share, at their meetings, they share their experiences. People identify because their experiences are generally much the same, except the circumstances are different. But what it does, it takes away an attribute of addiction, which is that each addict thinks his or her addiction is the worst and most unique addiction of all time. What meetings and sharings do is to make it so clear that they are just one more lousy addict. There's nothing special about them at all. So, also a feature of AA is that an alcoholic with experience mentors or becomes a mentor to one who is joining up. So there's a thread of mentorization. This is the concept behind cities in transition, that one divided society is in the best position to help another because the experience is similar, similar hopes, similar kind of conflicts, similar kind of divisions. So I only kind of got to the point of forming one after a couple of my called test runs. And the test run, first one was with a South African in 1997, when I arranged for the leaders of the parties in Northern Ireland to go to South Africa to meet with President Mandela and the leading negotiators from the various sides to the negotiations that led to the end of apartheid. And they spent 3 days with them. And the South Africans began by sharing individually their experiences of the conflict of apartheid or of the fight against, or for apartheid or against apartheid. And then the Northern Ireland shared theirs. And there were points of commonality between the two where you could see heads shaking around the table like, yeah, I understand, I get that, I've experienced that, that's just the way I think. But the better example was probably in 2007-8 when I took a group of South Africans and Northern Irish and took them to Helsinki to meet with a cross-section of Iraqi leaders, Shia, Sunni, and Kurd. And they went through a similar process of the Northern Irish and the South African shared how they had experienced their own conflict. And you could see again the Iraqis kind of shaking, nodding their heads at a certain point to say, identify with that, identify. That allowed them to establish a bond of trust and then to work together.
One of the things that because I saw some of this on your website, and it is all very fascinating, but I almost read the text on the website to be saying that actually the parties in conflict are in some ways the best to help each other through the conflict, which sounds sort of paradoxical, but there may be some truth in that, or maybe I just misread it or I misunderstood it.
No, parties in conflict. So let me illustrate that. So today, take that concept one step further. I invited 5 cities. I went to 5 cities: Belfast, Derry, Northern Ireland, Cyprus, Mitrovica, Tripoli in Lebanon, and Erbil in Kurdistan. I brought a cross-section of their leaders together to Boston, and I put them around a table. I said, all you have to do is to talk about how you each experienced your own conflict. And if you did experience it similarly, or can identify with what others were saying, then perhaps you might consider setting up a forum that you could use to help each other. So they all sat around a table for a day. First day, I kind of just talked about what their experiences were. Heads were nodding all the time, despite the differences in language and translation and culture. At the end of 3 days, they decided to set up this forum, which is based on the idea of one society in conflict is in the best position to help another. Each of these conflicts were at different stages of conflict itself. In some, the conflict was more active than in others. So the schema became one in which those who were on the higher rung of transition to some kind of normalcy would help those on the lower rungs.
Well, I want to ask you about that. Does that mimic, or is that taken from the Alcoholics Anonymous model? And related to that, which direction did this go? Did the AA model say, wait a minute, this could be applied to people in conflict around the globe? Or did you see all these people in conflict around the globe and say, well, maybe this is, what was the...
Well, I've been going to AA for a number of years before that. So it would have been the influencing driver.
Was there a moment where you said, da-da, wait a minute, this could apply there? Or was it...
When I went to the cities and explained the concept to each of them in turn, and what I wanted them to do, essentially come to Boston and do no more than just talk to each other, share the narrative of their conflict. So, those on the higher rungs of transition were useful in explaining to those on the lower rung, or mentoring them. Now, these were the steps that we took to bring our conflict to a non-violent stage. I called it, much after AA, I called that the process they were engaging in was a process of recovery to some stage of normalcy.
And what is normalcy? How would you define normalcy?
Normalcy, in my idealistic way at that point, was where it would be more or less like a Boston or a Detroit or a Dublin or a
so not without its issues.
Not without its issues, but not issues that divide people on the basis that divide people to the point of where they'll engage in violence to resolve them.
What motivated you to get into this work to begin with? I mean, why, of all the things you might have done or could have done or thought about doing, why'd you choose this field or this zone to work in?
It was accidental.
And what was the accident? What was the thing?
The primary accident was in my putting a Harvard fellowship on Muhammad Ali in 1971.
Say a little bit more about that.
Remember that one?
He's talking to his brother Peter off camera. But tell me, say a little bit more. Say a little bit more about that.
Well, it's in the movie. I'm not going to. I had a fellowship at Harvard.
Okay.
And I put the fellowship on, and Harvard, Muhammad Ali would win. Okay. And he lost. And then in 1972, the first thing that happened was in this bar at the Plough and Stars at instant of Bloody Sunday. That was on the 30th of January 1972. 14 civilians were shot dead by English paratroopers, and we organized a concert for the relatives of the dead young men at the Victory Road Armory, and we raised about $14,000, and about $1,000 per family, and I and a colleague took the money to Derry to give to the families, and I was shocked by what I saw. This was my first time in Northern Ireland. Even though I'd lived in Dublin for 25 years of my life, I'd never been like most Irish people, never go to Northern Ireland, as you know, most Irish people still never go to Northern Ireland.
What was shocking about it? What shocked you about it?
The troops, the tanks, the paratroopers all over the place. It was a very militarized city at that point. So there was another bombing in Dublin in a 1974, the worst bombing of the entire conflict. I think about 34 civilians were killed, and we repeated the thing of doing a concert. But at that point, I was feeling that it's kind of negative to do these concerts for relatives of dead people. Why not try to bring everybody involved in the conflict together? And that resulted in miraculously in a concert at Amherst, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, where we flew about 30 people over from Northern Ireland and the Republic for a week.
What year would that have been?
1974-5, September 1975, I think. And that was the first of its kind, and it was the first where there were paramilitaries present. It was before patriot laws and the like, banning terrorists in the country, or even the word terrorist was in the vocabulary. And then I took a lull after that until my brother Peter bumped into an editor at what was the name of the publisher downtown? It's a publisher that was in downtown.
I don't know.
It'll come to me. And I had just had published an op-ed piece, my first in the Globe, saying that the British government should talk to Sinn Féin.
What year are we in? What year are we in?
That would be 1980.
Okay.
Yeah, March 1980. And he said to Peter, "You should have your brother give me a call." Roby was his first name. The rest will come. I did. We had lunch, and he said, "Why don't you kind of write me a proposal?" Then I looked and I saw there were books written on everything in Northern Ireland. It was most written about subject even at that time. So I had this again kind of obvious idea that maybe what I should do is interview the people that I had brought to Boston in 1974, or start with them as introductions, which I did.
I want to ask you, as we start to wrap up this discussion, although there's so much more we can talk about, and I would love to talk about, where are we now? I mean, there's obviously conflicts every day when you open, as I'm going to say, the metaphorical newspaper that no longer exists, but you turn on your electronic device. And how much of this is related to cities per se, and how much is irrespective of urban environments? I mean, what's your prognosis looking forward?
Well,
across the globe,
yeah, I
up
think-
to all the
yeah.
various places of conflict.
I think we're what's called euphemistically an inflection point, and that is that the global rules-based order that was put in place post the Second World War at Bretton Woods has collapsed.
Do you think, has it collapsed or is it collapsing, or does
Collapsing, yeah. Part collapsed, part collapsing. And what will replace it has not yet emerged. The Chinese are already touting their own rules-based order, which they advocate through their project called the Road and Silk Project, which has about 120 member countries in it. But they believe they can build an alternative to the IMF, which they already have a bank that gives loans to countries that doesn't depend on kind of entrenching democratic capitalism as it's known in the West as being the epitome of its value system. That doesn't use the institutions under the Bretton Woods to resolve conflict, that the UN needs an overhaul. And the UN doesn't work either. It's functionless. With the Security Council is really a joke. It works in just certain things very, very good, but it doesn't do things related to conflict well at all. So you have this kind of again the emergence of great power struggle, more reminiscent of the late 19th century than the 20th century, where you have China on the rise, an ascending power, and the United States, many would believe, a declining power. It's a rising power and challenges the dominant power that will result in conflict. And Graham Allison, who is at Harvard, who propounded this theory, looked at, I think, maybe 16 conflicts from the 16th century on. And in the case of 1/3 of them, they ended in conflict. And if our experience with COVID is anything to draw on, countries did not cooperate. Countries put their own self-interest first, and then they cooperated. Not a very good
model in a way.
feature to base a future of cooperation on.
Well, Padraig O'Malley, I want to thank you for stopping by the Plough and Stars where we're sitting right now, which is one of the, I'll say, one of the best bars in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and you all should come here. But I want to thank you for taking time to talk to us about this topic, which is just fascinating. You've spent your whole life, your whole working life thinking about it. It's just been wonderful.
Enough of it.